Hello everyone, today we talk about 4th century Italic warfare, focusing especially on javelins of light and heavy type, also on spears, in fact lances, as we cannot quite classify sometimes the difference between a spear and a lance, and a javelin in this sense. Some of you also in the past were surprised about this because we live in a world in which we tend to categorize everything as if, that made a point. But aside from the possible historical, archaeological difficulties that stem from mostly the greatest problem is we have difficulty to reconstruct, right, the entirety of the system comprehensively. From the other side, there is the generic terms used by the sources that, however, are per se very often eloquent, even in very subtle semantic shades regarding what they were concretely defining. Another problem is the degree of archaeological quality, just of the material per se, that can degrade over time, and we have missing pieces and rarely, the entire structure sometimes of these weapons. However, all in all, we can trace a pretty good picture of the wall by approximation, always realizing, in fact, that in spite of our modernistic and technologistic perversion to think that, first of all, materialism makes the difference, that technology is decisive, a comparative and diachronic military historical expertise, which has, of course, nothing to do with any of this nonsense, provides us with a concrete idea of how warfare really worked at that time. And the 4th century BC is quite fascinating because it's fundamentally the moment in which Rome starts conquering most of central and southern Italy, and thus consolidates the Romano-Italic confederacy that will be at the base, fundamentally, of the Roman Empire per se. I told you that I would have started to talk more in depth about mostly Roman archaic warfare. This is not really an introductory video per se, it's a rather technical one about the aforementioned weapons, but as we were just saying, weapons are just like one side of the story that helps us, in fact, telling it better and illustrating a specific context that is the one in which, in fact, the Romans expanded, molded their military. In fact, in a century that would see essentially the creation of what we call the manipular legion per se. And today I will not digress on that specifically, because again, we have still to make properly introductory videos about that, and especially the genesis of manipular tactics is one of my favorite topics, and we can actually discuss it for a very long amount, multiple videos for sure soon if you're interested, because again, it's mostly a conceptual issue at the end of the day. There is a difference naturally between Rome and the other, I say Italian populations, because we're not just talking about Italics per se, we're talking, as we will see now, even about Illyrians, about actually Hellenic or Hellenized realities, so mostly Oscans, as you understand, for sure, but we must take into account even the influence of other military cultures, such as the Celtic one, and so we use the comprehensive Italian term to stress, in fact, mostly the peninsular dimension. Today we will mostly look at the best documented examples in a part of central southern Italy that is fundamentally the Samnium, Lucania and Apulia, but also some, say, Hellenic communities that are actually less documented on the coast, but that did influence even the customs of the Italic interland that was the prevalent, and as we'll see now, the more warlike, right? It's underestimated because most people just think about Rome and they hardly get what properly the Italic background, and eventually, in fact, most of where the Roman military would literally come from in terms of the Salci in some of the pivotal moments of, in fact, in Roman and thus in world history. So this reality I haven't, I think, ever discussed per se. We've made some videos about, say, basic manualistic videos about Rome and the Italics, but I presume you're acquainted to the ABC of the ethnic, the geographical, and the cultural background, right? We're talking essentially about this Indo-European populations that had settled in the Italian hinterland, right? And most of them still living in a tribal context, especially in the Apenninic hinterland. It is a quite rough, tough, cold, brutal, frankly, reality that, especially in the case of the Samnitic Confederacy, that was the one that definitely gave Rome most headaches among the Italian populations. And in fact, the Romans estimated as the only enemy worth of Rome, interestingly enough, retained a very interesting communitarian cohesion, right? They had common religion, customs, shared pastors. There were mostly cattle breeders, and Rome did suffer, as you know, during the what were conventionally in traditional historiography known as 3 Samnitic Wars, but that were something more complex that at some point we will discuss, even defeat, right? And that, however, were finally crushed by the Romans, who had a at least for these peoples, not much of an incomprehensible mentality, but just like a steamrolling idea of the fact that, as we've seen, they had just to conquer the world, not even the humiliation of the Caudine Forks. That was a big deal for those warriors, but that had still perhaps a romantic view of the world, in spite, of course, of their brutality and their effectiveness in this sense, because the Samnites fought both as guerrilla and occasionally, of course, also as open field hosts, but they mostly relied on this kind of, in fact, hit and run and so on. So you understand that javelin warfare is quite crucial in this phase, also because this is the moment in which the Romans, together with other Italic and Italian peoples, were not really adopting, but fundamentally improving what eventually would the heavy javelins that would have been known as the pila later on. This aspect is fascinating because you know that the alleged adoption of the scutum and the pilum is a major, say, feature in Roman warfare, right? In which, in fact, a bit, in a technologistic way, we attribute so much of Roman tactical success. But as I have explained multiple times, actually, that was basically the normal, really the standard among Central European populations. Let's say, aside from the Greeks that fought essentially in a different way by some degrees at least, because even in there we should stress how, even the concept of a phalanx was flexible even within the same Hellenic mentality that called a phalanx just like Roman heavy infantry, just as Celtic heavy infantry. So a term that it simply means rolling log. Even there is a sort of steamroll, right? But that's mostly another concept. And today we'll not digress on, of course, the what I think now it's been soundly assessed is the fact that the Romans nor any other Italic population, except the Italian ones as the same Hellenic Italiotes, ever adopted the Hellenic phalanx. That even in fact among the Hellenic colonists in the coasts of southern Italy weren't fighting like in the motherland, because the terrain was different, that the enemies were different, and more. but it's fundamental to observe what could be comparatively also the Roman background. Today, we do not look at specifically. We mostly concentrate on the aforementioned people. So mostly, again, the Samnites, the Lucanians, and the Apulians, right? With, again, some comparative, consideration. Also, talking about the Umbrians, the Romans, the Etruscans, the Gauls, etc., but chiefly that reality that would be absorbed by Rome, and from which an important amount of Solki would be drawn from in the Roman, essentially in the Roman military. The 4th century BC is also a primitive reality, right? The same Rome actually skyrocketed from an incredibly archaic background in many ways, and this was also one of the great advantages of Roman civilization. But the Apenninic hinterland was by far more brutally primitive than Rome, and in this sense, it also corresponded to the different development of political and social systems that were reflected in the military. There is hardly a real standardization, right? We can talk about standards just as much as these are functional to, like, human beings per se, but if we look at the archaeological finds of spears, lances, javelins, etc., we'll look at the weight of the spear, the length of its iron head were dramatically varying, right? They were customized to the point that a warrior could get a smith to make a spear head that suited his size and strength, as normally this was done, or even for just exactly at a point for the elite that could afford even the most sophisticated panoply to a perfectly anthropometric functionality, and thus the same weapons were properly differentiated, as we will see now, in kind for the type of combat that the warrior was expected to be engaged in. As you understand, the spear is by far the commonest offensive weapon that we find in this central and southern Italian late Iron Age warfare. And most of what we know, of course, comes from burials, even though some weapons have been found in sanctuaries where the spears were dedicated as votives, along with armor also captured from the defeated enemy, so the spolia, right, which is essentially the just the modernization of the human sacrifice in that regard, was offered to the gods, returned to the gods, because no earthly power was human merit for that matter, but just, of course, at least of the divine that entered in symphony with the same. Now, although we have an important amount of spearheads finds, it's difficult to reconstruct homogeneously the entire regional picture, right? First of all, there are different burial customs in different areas, right? Even among, within the same communities of some scale, right? And the worst documented areas are the coastal ones, especially the ones of the Hellenic cities of Magna Graecia. You would say, why? These were perhaps, the most urbanized, the richest places. Well, the point is that the Italiotes, so the Hellenic colonists of in Italy, did not normally bury weapons with their dead, right? And this has to do with the fact that, as we've seen also in those videos about the rise and fall of the Hellenic civilization as an Indo-European interpretation, they had basically abandoned the concept of a warlike afterlife. They were mostly looking at the sort of Dionysian or Orphic heaven that was, albeit quite materialistic, was mostly sensually based and not so rigidly framed like in a interland Italic background, right? So, given that some Italian communities in the close vicinity of the Hellenic polis of the Magna Graecia seem to have excluded weapons from their grave goods, we can't think there was an Hellenic influence there, but it basically doesn't go just like it's typical everywhere, in the Black Sea, in Gaul, whatever, but a few tens of kilometers in the hinterland, which is one of the reasons why, as I was saying before, also Hellenic warfare wasn't quite replicated, right? The use of Hellenic panoply as vastly as was done, especially among the Italian elites, like everywhere, was not reflective of the adoption of an actual hoplitic warfare. That again was a very specific thing that even in Greece was mostly just pertaining in the ideal way we have theorized just to Athens and Sparta, and even there with significant differences and that we have seen here and there. But I plan to make more videos about this topic, because just it's a merit to be able to change, to adapt, to just have to have your military culture, but being able to cope with the various threats, the various foes and terrains, and that's objectively also what the same Greeks did in places like Sicily and southern Italy. More of that later, because as you know, there were some specifically Italian influences even within Hellenistic warfare that are worth being mentioned as far as javelins specifically are concerned, right? It is also true, however, that there are some very hardcore Italic cemeteries, such as the 6th, 5th century one of Alfedena, so in times and places in which, again, the hardcore warlikeness was less spoiled, also in the Daunian tombs at Ordona, for example, in which spearheads are rare. Naturally, as we were saying before, the fact that the shafts were made mostly in organic material means that we mostly observe these weapons through what remained, right, in the metal of the head, right? In the Lucanian burials of the 4th century at Rocca Gloriosa, we find just one spearhead and made of bronze, which for the time being suggests that it was mostly like a ceremonial, like a purpose-made for burial type of weapon. We find there, however, still 8 tombs containing bronze belts, which were at the time part of the panoply of an Italic warrior. Such communities may have buried less weaponry for the simple fact that in times of war, those might have been very useful, and given that, of course, resources are limited, you don't want just to bury them every time somebody dies, and especially in the case of warriors that so the people who literally have the best weaponry, the one that is most useful and upkept at the moment, right? And this may be the same reason why, for example, the spears ceased to be buried with the dead at the tombs of Paestum after the 3rd quarter of the 4th century BC, which is exactly the moment in which the Romans are hitting hard the area and thus requiring the local resources to be committed against the invaders. And there is also a more material reason, geometrical even, we could say, for which the spears could not literally fit the in all their typologies in the burials. For example, there was a traditional Apulian ritual burial called the rannicchiato, which literally means the crouched one, right? So these were smaller graves, and the dual-purpose thrusting or throwing spear, we will see now the various types, was literally not fitting that space, right? Naturally, these things could change from a family to another, right? We find spearheads, for example, inside pit graves, the wooden shaft probably broken, Alternatively, the spear may be laid on the top of the cover slab, right, or broken and set against the edge of the pit with the point upwards, for example. What we see in this type of warfare, which is characterized, as we've seen, by a lot of skirmishes, a lot of guerrilla on this broken Apenninic terrain, again, incredibly tough grounds, is like a constant shower of darts of any sort, right? Which is a bit what we tend to forget about the ancient world. Like a typical battle would have been just topped by lots of, in fact, projectiles constantly crossing the air as a shower. In the case of, in fact, mountaineers and mostly these kind of very, also very militarily active and flexible military cultures, mostly infantry-based, like the Italic ones, you have to imagine literally just this being even more intense, right? There are similar contexts, like, I don't know, the Celtiberian one, or even the Iranian mountaineers. There could be compared, as a matter of fact. On the other side, there is a military like the Roman one, which is the one of a true, in fact, urbs that is conferring herself a statal profile. It has wide demographic and agricultural resources, and is also designed mostly as an emergent power to fight properly pitched battles in open field with impressive arrays, right? And so the need at that point to systematize a thicker, more compact, more punching volume of fire, in which, thanks to the appeal, the Romans were literally second to none. People say, but not, why not archers? Because, when you throw a heavy javelin at this, of course, at the short range that it's designed for, that's really, and in the way the Romans were trained for, and for also the type of targets that were hitting with that, a massive power. Right, and so there was a lot in between, because, as we've seen, these peoples preferred not to come down their valleys, their mountains, but when they did, of course, they were also pretty quick in taking the initiative with this kind of very aggressive warfare. Right, this is nothing like, for example, the Hellenic one. These are properly like barbarians; they're tribesmen. It's a type of warfare that we see is dramatically similar to the same Celtic one, because they had literally the same size of weapons, the same properly concept being, at some point Rome would engineer them further, something that also in propagandistic terms she was extremely proud of, and that's why the same reason why lots of people today think that the Romans actually copied something from others. But what we often forget is that the actual backgrounds were radically similar, right? These were essentially, as we'll see now, warriors with a spear, slash lance, and a helmet, a shield, a cuirass, at best, and that's it, which is basically the standard of every single people in Europe, at least in the sedentary one, even in North Africa, the exception being Greece, of course, that fought in a slightly different way, especially at this point, because we are essentially at the time of Alexander, of Philip II, so that's something that the Macedons brought forward. And as we'll see, there are actually interesting influences in Italy too at that time, not surprisingly, in fact, in Apulia, which is just, facing Epirus, as you understand. In any case, when we look at javelins, their specialization in general, of course, they were shorter than the normal thrusting spear, right? They could be fitted into burials without being broken, so we are somehow better documented about them for multiple reasons. And this just as far as the archaeological finds are concerned, right? And we have just to watch out, because if you find a javelin there and not a spear, doesn't mean that a spear was not used. And so the burial practices are not what happens on the battlefield or what is just displayed on the battlefield per se. It's obvious that in the large chamber tombs that became fashionable among the elites in the 4th century, given that in fact this word was, growing in a more hierarchical direction, the longest spears could be deposited unbroken, and we find them in even impressive numbers for even a single warrior. It was normal for the males of the warrior class, let's call it in this way, to be buried with weapons, right? As we were saying before, the Italic peoples were mostly tribesmen, so it was normal for the freeman just to be a warrior, but these communities are slowly, again, compacting. There is essentially urbanization undergoing slowly, gradually, especially in the interland. In the Apennine, you can't find it so powerfully. But the idea is that, as we can find, in fact, in more political realities like the Etruscan one, right, there was a very rich and narrow elite, and then basically all the rest of the people were serfs. For example, the Umbrians that bordered them were somehow influenced socially by this aristocratic system. But when we look at central and southern Italy at large, it's mostly still that kind of, in spite of being more influenced by Mediterranean civilization, still more directly and brutally warlike, especially on the Adriatic coast, that is somehow overlooked in this regard. So when we find, of course, these men buried, right, with their weapons, we assume they were part of their panoply, right, and so were used by them in war, right, or perhaps in hunting, which is actually the same thing. But this is not always true, because full-sized spears sometimes are buried with male children, which naturally was a way to express the military status of their clan that was hopefully also maintained by the boy in the afterlife, right? And this is, for example, the case of an exceptionally large spearhead, 45 centimeters long, right? It's just a thing literally to open people horrendously, and was buried together with an infant at Alife. Moreover, some graves contained multiple spears, and far more than could have been carried by a single warrior. Even counting, as we will see now, which is depicted in art, for example, like an attendant, some sort of weapon bearer, aide, whatever. For example, there is a tomb in Lavella which contains 2 burials, because these aides could say literally, and were expected to die either with they were probably not slaves, right? And we will see it now. But they were somehow part of the retinue, right, of the Gefolgschaft, of the Comitatus. And so the idea is that the lesser warrior had to ideally die before his master, or at least never being less than him, right? And we find in this double grave as much as 18 javelins and spears. This is quite interesting, because it may have been just maybe a war trophy, right? So weapons were stripped from the killed enemies, or these weapons could have been ritual gifts from the mourners. We don't know, but this tells a lot, generally speaking. First of all, about properly the background of these peoples and how important weaponry really was for them, as a matter of status and beyond. But also one fact that we actually don't know about the same Roman army, that is we are told that normally a warrior, later a legionnaire, would be equipped with essentially 2 heavy javelins, also of different types. I mean, a lighter one for the greater distance and a shorter one for the shorter one. In fact, that were specifically calibrated to be thrown at precise moments of the charge, right, to maximize this impact in an incredibly refined tactic. But as far as we are concerned, we don't know whether this band could be simply supplied with more javelins during combat. What the hell do we know whether a Roman legionnaire had, 2 pila and maybe through 14 during a battle? Like, that most battles, as we will make a video soon about this too, were spent literally skirmishing, right? Even between a melee and another, right? The line's distance, and they spent all this time essentially throwing javelins at each other, including the pila, that we, in this sense, we have somehow sclerotized as, a super Roman weapon, but it was just like a heavy javelin. Like, it was used basically by everyone, by the Celts, by the Libyans, that fought, in fact, in that same way, right? So always there, remember, always, it's not the technology alone is zero. Doctrine is everything, right? And of course, the moral forces required to make it work. And there aren't many options with this kind of technology. How many ways are there to make it a heavy javelin, as a matter of fact, or a javelin as a whole? We know from the 12 tables in Rome that extravagance in funeral burials was prohibited, like a sort of sumptuary law, because the state wanted to control so the disposal of resources and channeling them in kind of less kind of privatistic direction and more in public ones, especially as far as war was concerned, of course, to keep the struggle towards the outside. However, we see from, in fact, Italic burials that normally there were 2 javelins. So just like eventually what the Roman legionnaire would be as the standard. Talking about spears specifically, there was the heaviest type in the 4th century with a long blade shaped like a willow leaf and reinforced by a central rib. This was definitely too large and heavy to have been thrown. I mean, it's possible if you have literally nothing to use, you can literally use everything. But it's obvious opologically that it was designed as a thrusting spear. And this fits broadly, like, again, pretty much any other people fighting on foot at the time. At Canosa and Lavello, we find this heavy spear associated with horse trappings, which suggests in this era that the local Apulian horsemen had learned to fight with a heavy spear held in both hands, a bit like the contos that we find among the Iranians and the Macedons. And given that we're talking about the 4th century and that these Apulians are in good part also descendants from Illyrian tribes that had crossed the Adriatic, it's fair to say that just because of geographical proximity, there may have been a Macedonian influence as far as the conquest was concerned. This may have to do just also with the country itself. These areas are just like close to the Tavoliere, which is basically this massive plain. It's basically the only plain existing in southern Italy, which is like perfect for a cavalry warfare. And it seems, in fact, these people specifically had among the strongest cavalry, right? If not the most extensively mounted warfare in Italy, right? We will see companion cavalry at some point, but in that case, it was mostly the rich citizens of the Hellenized Oscan Italic, in fact, settlements that could afford, in that sense, a horse, etc. But it's not much different from, what the nobility of the great Hellenistic capitals was a cavalry-like, which is not a bit the more brutally feudal way that the Macedonians or these Apulians and other Illyrized populations could actually be by a more ancestral background. And consider that Roman warfare is often credited like the Romans didn't have much of a cavalry. They have been fighting strenuously against this prejudice. Simply, it's not true. The fact that you have less cavalry than other peoples actually doesn't speak of its quality, and even if it had been just for the Roman citizen cavalry, consider that the Italics normally fielded twice as much as the Romans properly in the social legions, and they had pretty damn good cavalry. In Polybian times, they were also pretty numerous. Telling you the truth, that it was actually the peak of cavalry used numerically in all Roman warfare, right? And if you look just at what the Roman elite, the aristocracy, they were all horsemen, right? And properly knightly minded, psychopathic serial killers that spent their entire life on horseback chopping people to pieces. And this is literally what the hardcore equestrian and military cult that you can find all in the whole Roman mythology and sagas was about, and it was probably even more alive among these other Italic populations. So, that the Celts were also brutally obsessed with, especially the Gauls actually, with cavalry, and so they were basically the same thing. So we often give for granted the fact that, especially a Roman military that developed the way it did, and also rationalizing through the consolidation of infantry, was somehow less of an equestrian culture than, say, the Gallic War, where, again, the nobility was literally obsessed with horses, but that because of lack of political and social cohesion could field actually lots of cavalry, but they didn't have actually much of a good quality, and for some reason people still believing so. And I did find documentaries etc. that stated this thing, which is wrong, right? And just reading sources, also because this is yet another prejudice that comes from Roman literature, right? So it's very funny when people always blame the Romans for having created their propaganda, as if, by the way, any other people didn't do exactly the same. And it wasn't a merit to be a civilized and literate people to have an historiography, and it's not Caesar's fault if the Gauls didn't have a literature. But also, picking exactly just what you can distort to the favor of your own narrative, as opposed to, saying that all the rest is propaganda, right? That's the unfortunate moral and scientific lack of standards we live in. But unfortunately, the masses are that radically undereducated, and that's something we have to deal with, sadly, every day. There was yet another type of, let's say, large spear, lighter than the previous one, but still essentially designed to thrust in contexts of the last half of the 4th century. It has a long but narrower blade compared to the previous one, and it's also strengthened by a median rib. The hand is sometimes marked off from the iron shank by a narrow neck. While these typologies existed from older times, we notice in this century essentially a divarication, essentially a further specialization. And given the long and heavy hand, but that of course makes of this weapon a thrusting spear, the weakening of the neck suggests that it was intended to bend or to break on impact if thrown, right? So it was more like both of a thrusting and throwing spear. It's found both in graves of both infantry and cavalry, interestingly enough, because consider that, of course, any cavalryman is capable of fighting, of course, on foot as well, and the more you specialize it, and the least adequate he is. But in these contexts, again, there is they're not very socially stratified communities, right? So even the type of combat is somehow more hybrid as far as the mounted and dismounted one is concerned. But it's obvious this narrower blade and narrower neck to make it more like a thrown weapon than the other. right? This is the same reason, because if you have a larger blade, you just, stick it with your force within somebody's body, and it's, again, opening horrendous wounds. If you throw it, you don't have really the capacity of, even exploiting that width, and you hope it's going just to pierce, to thrust in a certain place, which, if you are aiming at the joints, as a matter of fact, it's going also to penetrate more the target accordingly, and so you can see this gradation in the spear. There are also light kinds of spears, like with a short but wide blade, for example, reinforced by a central rib, with its maximum width at something like 1/3 of the length from the base of the blade. We find one in Lavello, for example, in a burial of a horseman, together with many other spears and javelins, significantly enough. Given its size, it's fair to say that it was thrown mostly. It was kind of javelin, because the point of a thrusting spear is also remaining at an important distance from the enemy. So if it's that short, it's because you're also facilitating somehow the throw. Yet a same type found in Ordona displays a sauroter as well. So this butt ant, literally the lizard killer, because that's how you finished off, the dying, the wounded on the ground while you were advancing, and with a butt ant, so you could still essentially handle the weapon in the functional direct thrusting way, but just piercing with the butt towards the ground, you could simply finish off these people, and this tells us that this is to be found in javelins sometimes, for a simple use. It was the same you can find in spears, generally speaking. If this weapon was broken, or you would just find yourself to engage an enemy in desperate conditions, you can employ it as a last resort, right? Or you can maybe stick it to the ground and using it in an anti-cavalry function, right? Maybe even properly holding this. As you understand, it's a spear, but also javelin at the same time. That's how much you can't categorize it, right? So there are many ways you can use these weapons that, of course, have been lost in the practical knowledge, together with these warriors' wisdom. But you can imagine the widest range of possibilities in which it could be employed, and also here, essentially, just like a spear/javelin, both on horseback and on foot. One of the commonest types of weapon in this 4th century Italic graves has a long and thin shank, circular, mostly square in section, at 3/4 of the length from the base, tapering continuously towards the point, which is sometimes flattened into a small blade. Sometimes this point is corroded to the point that it's difficult to distinguish it from a sauroter of a thrusting spear. And when we find such one piece with a single spearhead, it is mostly likely to have been the butt of the same spear. In others, it's rather just the only iron object instead, or where there is no matching spearhead, it is more likely to have been the head of a javelin, and that's how we have more or less to orientate ourselves about it. We find this type of javelin mostly with bronze belts of horsemen, or also infantry, with full armor, occasionally. Sometimes we find it also together a second javelin or heavy thrusting spear, but more commonly, and this is yet another underappreciated aspect, with a long knife for fighting at close quarters, because of course there is not just a mere skirmish. Actually, in those military contexts in which you carry out a hit and run strategy, you are actually more likely to be involved in even individual fighting, because you are mostly, again, either a guerrilla fighter or cattle raider, things like that. So on this broken terrain, this sudden attacks at night, and on difficult terrain, in many ways, you can find yourself to deal with things at close quarters, as much as you are, of course, in the melee of a great open field clash. But in that case, you would mostly have arrayed your troops in a way that will be functional to their employment of not just knives, but properly swords, that we will see in another video anyway. And this type of javelin was used also all across the social spectrum, as we've seen also as cavalry. As far as Apulia is concerned, specifically, it seems to have been the principal weapon, right? This doesn't mean we're talking necessarily about lighter troops, right? There are also heavy troops using it. But as far as the Tarentines, for example, that export their, if anything by name, their type of warfare, you realize that the presence of such, in fact, javelin as the principal weapon, also in a land where, as we've seen, there is plenty of cavalry, surely brought to the popularization of it through still needs that were, say, separated from an Apulian context in the Hellenistic world, broadly meant. So this guy just fights essentially with a shield and a javelin, per se. And naturally some side weapons too, but mostly as that kind of, in fact, medium cavalry, you could argue, that can, in fact, switch to both roles at a time, but is not necessarily or specifically designed to charge just straight, right? Cavalry can just do so, right? If you equip it just with javelins, they're there mostly to run, but it can still chase and smash lighter troops, etc. If we look at the type of javelin we have just described as the most common, we realize that it matches particularly well with Polybius' description of the so-called grosphos, which the Hellenic author says was used by light Roman troops during the 2nd century BC, right? So in his times, and that had a wooden shaft of only 2 cubits, that is essentially 93 centimeters long, was a finger thick, and it had a head, one span that is 23 centimeters long, elongated, sharpened, so much that, like some previous types that you've seen, it was designed to bend at impact, right, and have this head designed properly to penetrate also narrow gaps. And according to Polybius, because that's mostly all the information we get about the grosphos from, it was used by the youngest and poorest troops, but in the 2nd century BC. So in quite a different context from the fort, in which, as we will see now, it may have actually been used by even troops, say, provided with an important, not much role per se, but somehow, first of all, functionality, and not just in a military sense. Right, in Polybius' times, he says they were equipped with this javelin and just with dagger and a light shield, right? So the typical light infantry, a skirmisher. However, we know in the late 3rd century, at the siege of Capua, during the Hannibalic War, that the Romans trained legionnaires to fight with the Iacula, so literally the javelins, those that have to be thrown, etymologically, that were at the time, according to Livy, in fact pertaining to the light armored troops, but that were deployed in fact behind the heavy riders. And this aspect is fascinating because it shows that, first of all, the late 3rd century Romano-Italic legionnaire, and we just saw how especially the Italic background was provided with this important kind of hybrid between infantry and cavalry, could just simply mount on horseback. Right here, the source says, literally, the guys were trained to use these lighter javelins, but, you know, not trained to be horsemen, per se. Right, and of course, they, as javeliners on horseback, they were mostly to support the heavy cavalry behind them, right, as a sort of retinue. But they were up to it, and also, you know, functional, successful way. Livy says that each of these men carried 7 such javelins, 4 feet long, which also matches fundamentally as it's almost 120 centimeters long. And you see already the hybrid there. From the 4th century, we see these javelins were pretty much everywhere, and we can think that the Romans, albeit specializing already in a kind of heavier type of warfare, like properly in a conventional way for great powers of the time, were probably much better acquainted to this kind of weapons by then. In the 3rd century, you must train these guys to use these lighter javelins, which they're fundamentally up to, but just require some training. In the 2nd century BC, you just see the lighter and poor troops using them. So you can appreciate there that from a Roman Hellenic historiographic perspective, how the Roman legion kind of toughened up, right, and became heavier in those 2 centuries. When we look at also this impact, which is designed to penetrate, but also the enemy shield or armor, but remaining thus stuck in a worthless, rendering hopefully useless the shield, especially as that was the main thing. We realized that this type of weapon was heavier than what Polybius Grossfus is designed like, right? You know, it must have had a much greater penetrating power when thrown by a skilled warrior. It was more like a heavy javelin, right? And as such, however, it could have been useful also in hand-to-hand fighting, because if you actually hold the shaft firmly with your hand, you can even parry some sword thrust, and this tells you essentially what the pilum was coming from as a broader type of weapon, more adaptable type of weapon. It wasn't just, you know, what we most stereotypically think as a missile, right? Everything can do, especially when you have in this warrior background such an important assortment and calibration, as you understand, of weapons used mostly also at the same time. Thus, what you can distinctly see in the 4th century here is somehow the process of the Proto-Pilum emerging from properly already a kind of heavy javelin typology, right? And in the later centuries, in the Roman army, you just see this consolidation for the heavy infantry and other types of darts for the light, right? And never underestimate the fact that the Roman legionnaire was actually capable, as we've just seen, of, you know, being trained for the most different tactical purposes, even just as light skirmishing infantry, where such weapons could have turned out useful. Now, there is a good example of this weapon in a crater of the 2nd quarter of the 4th century, which depicts 4 native Italic youths. So listing them, one has just dismounted from his horse. He has 2 javelins in his left hand, and he's aiming a 3rd one with his right at a fallen warrior who holds a spear behind a shield in his left hand and a short sword in his right. So this already pictures beautifully the just the quickness, right, in which these weapons were used, right? You hold them while you are riding, and when you dismount and you're ready to hit, and they're not just small darts, right? They are something bulkier, and this tells you again how complex and intense this combat standard really was. These were people, again, living mostly in continuous warfare, so they had properly that warrior like individualistic mentality, and this increased dramatically their level of individual training. Then on the same source you find an infantry warrior behind the first guy with shield and spear in his left hand, aiming a javelin with his right at a fourth warrior armed with a shield and a single spear. The javelins are shown technically as short spears grasped at the point of balance near their large heads, right? So this would suggest, like, properly, at least in the intention of the artist, like properly thrown weapons as such, and it makes sense because you have to direction the head, and then the shaft is acting just as a stabilizer. Then there is another beautiful picture from an Apulian column crater in Ruvo, previously part of the Yatta collection. Here you see a long-haired Italic warrior with a round shield on his left arm, preparing to throw a spear at a short-haired Italic enemy, whom he has already wounded with his first spear. Right, so, and the striking warrior has thrown aside his two spears and shield, so he has surrendered and holds out his arms in supplication. Right. We have an important amount of pictorial sources too, next to the archaeological ones. For example, in the Lucanian red figure bases, we have an important amount of Italic warriors depicted, and there is an unusual scene on a bell crater preserved in Vienna today, in which a warrior with helmet and small round shield advances with a thrusting spear, followed by a companion with helmet, belt and protective disc, holding in turn two spears on his left shoulder and a feathered javelin in his right hand. This definitely looks like a companion of the main warrior, right? He's too well kept to be a serf or a slave, right? You can't blurry perhaps the distinction between the even free men as far as the master and some client was concerned, but it's also possible that there is a anographic difference as far as maybe the warrior is older, or is just, again, there is a hierarchy in the family, right? So we could be seeing like an elderly and a youth, the latter essentially learning the craft, carrying a variety of spare spears for the older guy, and like a sort of squire, right? And this is typical of as you understand, a somehow heroic still style warfare that does fit, in fact, these aristocratically dominated worlds that, as you understand, also in these figures are fundamentally commissioning works of art that celebrate that kind of political and social divide, which is quite importantly revolving around war and its prestige. Then we have an important set of companion red figure bases that show a different type of Italic warrior. Here what you see is mostly very Hellenic influence in art, as you can notice. So the Italic culture was quite crude per se, as just, you know, for a Roman, just dedicating oneself to the letters was considered too effeminated for a warrior, right? So we have mostly just this panoplies telling us the story. But given that the pictorial sources are somehow detailed, they show us the guys in action, at least of how they thought they looked. We must look at them, always realizing, however, that there are some canons being followed, right? So these different areas follow some different artistic styles that mostly come in a sort of series. And here we find a different type, in fact, of Italic warrior depicted, often with a plumed helmet, a belt, and a triple disc breastplate, like the typical one you see among the Samnites, stereotypically. However, the best representations of this type of warriors are on the frescoes from the tombs of Capua and Paestum, that are, in fact, also the best art representing them. And of course, dueling is between two warriors is a common theme. Fascinatingly enough, and here I uploaded some of those pictures, you see these two warriors fighting at close quarters with thrusting spears. And interestingly enough, they are often actually transfixing each other's limbs, but also piercing each other's shields with spears. So what we can think is, aside from the heroic deed, like the idea of some squires that were bringing other spears to the hero, we also can simply think that these other weapons were thrown by the single warrior before coming into close combat, right? One of the best paintings here is the one on the north wall of the tomb, number 7, from the Gaudo necropolis at Paestum, in which you see literally each warrior having been transfixed. You see either in the thigh or in the chest, while they also both thrust each other with a spear. Which is significant also for the type of warfare that was entailed. I mean, these troops were not just, again, balleting all around. They were really going there face to face, transfixing each other, multiple wounds, and you know how risky this was before antibiotics. So you have to think even about properly the natural selection stemming from these contexts, where you realize there is a big deal of athleticism exactly in these centuries, as again, just for the type of armor that we see was still kind of muscular and very, very heavy for the elite, plus fighting on horseback, so requiring a dramatic physical fitness that truly entailed being pretty beefy in some way and being exposed to an important amount of wounds that your constitution should have just been able to bear, aside from what the medical treatments were at the time. We find a fragment of a painting in one of the tombs from the Saint Nicholas of Albanella necropolis, when one warrior has his right arm drawn back clearly in the act of launching a javelin. I inserted this pretty well, right? So, of course, overarm and towards the actually seems to be a lower target, at least compared to his hand. There's a tomb painting from Capua that went destroyed during the Second World War, as it was preserved in the Campanian Museum, which offers a slight variation in this theme, because the warrior on the left of the picture is about to hurl a large bladed spear, which he holds with his finger in a throwing strap, right, while his enemy on the right, whose left leg has been transpassed by a thrown spear, is about to raise a lighter javelin with feather butt, which he holds under his right arm, right? And the latter type may have been a grossfoss, as it's very long and tapering, and it seems to be, in fact, more kind of javelin-oriented design. So it's possible that were weapons, by the way, were that you know, thrown with some projectors that helped, of course, the just the warrior, and we have to naturally imagine the distances that could be covered, some tens of meters, and so in the art we don't see that quite, because the warriors are often at close range just for the sake of representation. But this type of skirmishing also, I don't know, think about from a cliff or rocks and somewhere in this mountainous rugged terrain, was, you know, something that could fall from impressive distances, and also loaded with an important force, right, which is never, like, geography doesn't dictate the way you fight. You just adapt to it and you find solutions. But the idea that, you know, in a rocky mountain, let's say, just for the fact that in a mountain situation you just don't control the valleys, so you're poorer and you resort to guerrilla more frequently, but also, you know, you can't literally exploit gravity sometimes, just like at the Codin forks on the horns on the hills in the valley and so on. Can increase the importance of missile warfare in this in the context. We have other interesting paintings, such as the one from the Andriolo necropolis at Paestum that dates to the last decades of the 4th century, showing 2 rows of warriors with large round shields and multiple different types of helmet facing each other across the battle line, holding long spears at the rear. And there is a small naked figure that is wearing a plume helmet and a small round shield, standing in the middle, ready to hurl a javelin at a battle line on the left. Right, so the weapon depicted appears to be tipped with feathers at the butt, and also in this case it has a throwing strap, which the thrower has wrapped around the wrist and index finger to his right hand. To the left of his hand, between his thumb and the crest of his helmet, the beginning of the iron shank of the javelin is marked by a double line, while the tip of its head protrudes to the left of his helmet. This was therefore a long-shanked Proto-Pilum, as the one we were talking about before, and evidently designed also to strike some kind of heavy infantry array. Thus, during the end of the 4th century, of course, showing the aforementioned process of, let's say, in fact, distinction, specialization is a heavier type of javelin against more compact types of formation that were evidently developing, not just in Rome, but also among these Italic people, by a lesser degree, arguably, but not with that dramatic difference you may imagine, right? That's an important amount of evidence, after all, and it tells us again that the Italic warrior was essentially trained to use a wide variety of sophisticated weapons, each designed essentially for a particular type of combat employment. We don't know much from literary sources. At least the 4th century, as you know, also as far as Roman historiography is concerned, is still between myth and reality. And properly the technicalities, as described, say, by Livy, are somehow, too distant, and also from an author like him to properly grasp in the exactness, right? However, and that's what I was talking about at the beginning of the video, we know from Livy, say, the organization of the, in fact, what we call the Livian legion around 340 BC, at least on the eve of the Latin War, which is practically what we think had been established, like eventually the Manipular Legion, from the Camillian reforms of the 4th century. You know that there is all the idea that there was a Servian reform back also centuries before that had introduced even a sort of a politic array, the democratic this organization of an Etruscan city-state in Rome, right? But the Roman army was changing much more gradually from a sort of rather clanic tribal warfare that had relatively few to do also with a democratic section as we imagine it in a political context, right? The Etruscans, as we've seen, had a dramatically unequal society with a strong elite and that would essentially monopolize warfare because all the others were just serfs that could be levied just in case of greater involvement. The Romans, as Latins, were on average less stratified. They were per capita wealthier in that sense, but they also were essentially a clanic feudal society in many ways, and quite heroically, oligarchically oriented, as you understand. Nevertheless, it's at this point that Rome, by systematically subjugating her neighbors, was providing herself with a more statal profile, still hegemonized, of course, by the oligarchy that had, however, successfully began to arm to confer properly the imperium to some plebeian magistracies and so on. So, channeling this the plebs towards, in fact, the rank and file trooper, brutally disciplining in some of the most violent ways imaginable and transforming the Roman army in the beautiful exterminating machine that we all know. And this ferocity, of course, was passing through the realization that you must channel the warlike spirit under an important degree of especially collective discipline. And that's how the Livian Legion eventually, but we call the Polybian one, it still changed over time, as you understand, and the 4th century witnesses a lot of back and forth, probably even for political reasons within Rome. But fundamentally, at the end of the 4th century, arrives, is consolidated, more or less, for Livy to remember, to describe it, and not that it's an unreliable source per se, but it's very complicated to dig in the past, even for a civilization like the Roman one that, however, had such a fast spread that didn't have time to sediment kind of a deeper historiographical awareness like other peoples, because again they were emerging from that tribal military context rather than kind of a civil or literate one. And from what we have seen about javelins nowadays, we can guess that something similar was happening, of course, in the rest of central and southern Italy, to a different degree than Rome, that objectively was the most important and powerful center, and that was in fact much more urban per se than most of these peoples. And Livy definitely talks about an authentic tradition of the army dating to the 4th century BC when describing that moment. So we are aware of the fact that these military developments were essentially undergoing the same time Rome was fighting these other peoples that also were coping with her in different ways, right? At some point, we've seen it at the Battle of Suessa, there is the strange couple, Rome that fights side to side with the Samnites against the Latins in the aforementioned Latin War. So they were similar peoples after all, in spite of the political social differences. So at this point, the legion had already subdivided into what we call, in fact, the maniples, and arranged in the 3 lines formation. So the first one, famously enough, is the astati, consisting at this point, because equipment did change, importantly enough, of 2 classes of spearmen, right? The Roman legion was always like the Polybian one, even the manipular one, like in Polybian times, where you would not even say, what are spears? Just the triarii had it, because I saw it on video games. Now, things did change over time, and we'll have to make a video about that. And so much that, in fact, the same name of astati, famously enough, it's because they were provided with an hasta, right? Which is a spear, as a matter of fact. Livy calls the astati florem juvenum pubescentium, so literally the flower of the adolescing youth, right? And so these were the craziest, more loaded, flexible, mobile, exalted, and fanatic elements of the army, most of which carried shields, right? These were the troops that had to prove everything in front of the others, so it's just like we've seen it in Celtic warfare, in Germanic warfare. They were meant to show off and to see what they were made of, or getting killed right in front of the battle lines before the main engagement. Now, 20 of these troops were equipped, according to Livy, only with spears, that is the astai, and heavy javelins. Gaisa, these are the terms that Livy uses for what he calls the leves, so literally the light/levy, and that's where the etymology comes from. The other lines were the principes and the triarii, famously enough, the latter fighting with the astas, well, and presumably at this point the principes too, given that they were still heavy infantry fundamentally, and also the levies here are actually still in part heavy infantry, meaning that they can withstand the fight as a battle line, not just as skirmishing troops. Now, I will not digress on the relative interpretational problems, like why we think certain things. Now, let's just stick to the astati for a while, because we have just seen that there were essentially 20 light-armed spearmen in the fore of the same astati battle line. And the interesting aspect of this is that they weren't, like, say, in the Hellenic world, like Serbs or particularly poor people. Remember that those equipped with the grossfoi in Polybius times were the poor elements. Well, in Polybius times, yes, there's this stereotypical thing that there were the 3 battle lines still fighting in a kind of different way, but actually they were homogenizing, right? So much so that by the time of the Marian reform, they were already indistinguishable. They had model on the base of the princeps that was kind of the most functional of these troops for how the Roman military had evolved. In the 4th century BC, given also the evidence that we have illustrated today, you realize that, and also thanks to the Livyan description, that these troops were not, say, lesser people from especially a social point of view, because the system was originally based on age, right? Meaning that even the young, when we say because we mix it up normally when we talk about Polybian times, and we don't understand what it really meant, right? To make the long story short, these 20 light-armed spearmen in the front were part of the Roman elite, right? These were the youths of the children of some of the, probably of the freemen that in theory are noblemen per se. This is just like, again, in the Celtic world and the Germanic world. When Rome was more tribal, it was in fact, age that made the difference, as opposed to wealth. Later on, it becomes instead a matter literally of census, of class, that was more rigidly affirmed in a system, was becoming ever more hierarchical and richer, and so also needed to count on the patrimonial assets more. So if we compare Rome with the Italic world, we can assess that in the latter, of course, the age division was even stronger as opposed to the social one. In that, probably among the Italics, that the role in front of the ranks as just one. Again, yes, these are the youngest people. They have a lot to prove. They're not accomplished yet. At the same time, they are still part of the good clans that select their individuals like that, right in the front lines, in the most dangerous combat by a degree. And the interesting aspect of Livy's description is that these troops were special in role as they used both Gaisa and Astai, right? The difference here with an average skirmisher is crucial, because hasta can be a spear of any kind, and it commonly actually means a throwing spear rather than the kind of a heavy type of one. Consider the asta militaris, for example, literally, pertained to what would become the skirmishers par excellence later on, say in Polybian times. So we could say that Livy was referring to a traditional type of spear that could be used, as we've seen in the Italic finds, both for thrusting and throwing, right, from one side, as far as the asta is concerned. The gaisum, instead, was another heavy javelin, the gaisum grave iaculum, literally, so the gaisum heavy javelin, per se, that we find also in Gallic warfare, famously enough, so much that there were the gaisati, that were those, in fact, equipped with those kind of weapons. That the Romans called their units with the name of their weapons, differently from the Greeks that called them with the name of their shields, right? That already tells you properly, Roman mentality, that is one of the most brutal that you can imagine, properly the aggressiveness, the moral load of this culture. That we find still, in fact, in Gallic warfare in Caesar's times. And the gaisum and the pilum, as a matter of fact, are very similar in nature, so much so that just for the scutum, we can't even properly tell, and it would be a mistake to try to distinguish an Italic or a Celtic origin. That even the tureos comes about in Hellenistic warfare exactly at the time in which the Gauls were invading Greece. I recently made a video about the Skordisci, but that it's exactly the same years in which Pyrrhus invades Italy and brings Oscan warriors, exactly the guys that we have described from central and southern Italy, back to Greece. And so the tureos, that also adapts in size according to Hellenistic needs, because it originally literally meant door, and that's how big it was in Celtic and Italic warfare. In the tureos instead comes to be smaller, normally, on average, at least in Hellenistic warfare. Tells you how, this broader Celto-Italic influence was probably stemming from a quite homogeneous background. And as I was saying before, especially these Central European populations were pretty much oriented towards a kind of idea of a solid spear wall of some sort with the skirmishers in the front. I made videos about Celtic warfare extensively. We will be talking about the Italic one, but as we've seen just in Libyan times, the Roman army was pretty much the same. They still had the spear as a main weapon, and don't think even that, in early imperial times, the spear actually was such a rare weapons among the legionnaires, and we know terribly few actually about Roman warfare overall. Don't think we're dramatically documented, of course, compared to other peoples, but we're still talking about 2,000 years ago. It doesn't matter how big Rome was, but let's say there are still lots of gray, if not dark areas regarding much of their military thing, and in part exactly because they came from the background that we just described. So when we speak of the Geisum in a Roman context, from a 1st century BC source, that is definitely using some older sources from those centuries, we can identify the long-shanked javelin that we observed before with the Gallic counterparts in the late 4th century, right? And I will make a video about the Battle of the Allia River that, as you know, is the Roman defeat against the Gauls that brings likely what we call the Camillian reform to have taken place, and thus also the manipular one, for reasons that we'll explain better. And there are interesting even hints about essentially the equality of Gallic and Italic weaponry, and we can easily see it as far as the spears are concerned, the swords are concerned, and illustrating essentially a very homogeneous warfare that you can easily see even as culturally from the fact that, I don't know, the Gallic declension is identical to the second Latin one, and so we're talking about very similar peoples, contrary to what ethno-nationalism would like to make you believe nowadays for 19th century reasons that have nothing to do with the hardcore imperial Catholic universal European tradition, and that was shared beautifully by both the Celts and the Italics, as a matter of fact, as much as any other Indo-European and beyond. So when we look at the Livian legion, always bear in mind that the Roman legionnaire at this point is dramatically similar still to the Italic warrior, right? And that Rome wasn't, the Romans were somehow developed. There was an important literacy already at the time. Rome was a big center and all, but sometimes we forget the primitiveness of what Rome was, properly from a cultural point of view, still at this point, and consider that, again, most of what we know is something between myth and reality. So we don't have a full picture of most things that were going on, but these data are crucial, because just for a historiographer of the caliber of Livy, the fact that the Livian legion had been, in fact, it's been called after him, but in fact had been an accomplishment worth remembering in a culture like the Roman one that wasn't too just historically versed just from a literary point of view. What was part of a big military legacy that the Romans were particularly proud of, to the point of passing it down to the generations like that. The interesting aspect of these levies is that they had apparently little or no defensive armor, right? So the likely tactical function was essentially preceding their heavier comrades, hurling their heavy javelins at the enemy and withdrawing in what Livy calls the intervalla ordinum, so the intervals in the order of the formation, so between the various maniples or centuries. Presumably, we don't know how it happened, but as far as the light troops, you can't do it. We find it even in the Middle Ages, etc. We don't know how maniples swapping technically happened. Everything is just an hypothesis. One can be better than another, but we literally don't know. And any person who has ever studied the sources of Roman military knows that universally we don't know. And the role was, however, proving themselves also for the courage of coming that close to the enemy, essentially without, particularly great hopes to simply just to engage them in hand-to-hand combat. Yet it could have happened, and it was part of these youths' exaltation to prove that they could take on even a heavier enemy and showing they were bigger than them, because that would have been a manifestation of the divine imperium to the greatest. In any case, at that point, the Roman legion is already something, right? We see it in action. In fact, at the Battle of Suessa, there are, again, I made a video about that so you can appreciate it in many ways. And there was obviously an heroic role, because these weren't even just retainers of a bigger warrior, right? The Roman army had already tended towards the collectivization, and thus properly making this specific class of troops, performing that role, which is still in between, being just becoming skirmishers and still being individual heroes that had to prove that being so for some of their first times in their lives, right, and gaining the prestige that derived eventually from the more powerful lines in the rear. And we actually know that there was a lot of cavalry warfare involved in this. I mean, in Libyan times, not so much per se, but generally speaking, this idea of skirmishing, fighting. The same Battle of Suez actually had in its prodromes exactly something like that. Mostly it was like literally two knights clashing against one another with spears, but also javelins, right? And so you can't say in the various vicissitudes of war there when kind of the cavalry would come in, and of course they were also supported by foot troops in the process. So it was probably a much more dynamic warfare than we actually think. In fact, we have a young Lucanian warrior depicted in heroic nudity on tomb 114 in the Andriolo necropolis at Paestum, advancing in front of the battle line to throw his javelin, protected only by his shield. So it's evident that these individuals were considered like, oh my god, these were, even technically, again, it's such a poorly stratified reality, maybe the same guys who would originally be within the single phalanx, and that were just coming out that and engaging the enemy and coming back. And this is how mostly combat actually occurred, especially in a single line. The reason why it's different from the Roman one is that, as we've seen after the Battle of the Allia River, the Romans opt for an in-depth formation with 3 battle lines that, again, must have not been necessarily only the only way they fought, but became pretty standards. We don't know what happened precisely during the 4th century. We just know that this quite bulky thing was already put in action with great effectiveness. So it was already an advanced stage of fighting. But before that, saying at the beginning of the 4th century, the same Romans, like at the Battle of the Allia River, fought in a single line, in a single phalanx. And that's why at the Allia just the Gauls basically outflanked them, and the phalanx crashes entirely. They wanted to create reserves. Of course, with all the the balance that you must take in consideration as far as the possibilities of narrowing the front are concerned. But in that single phalanx that the same, this actually the same Celts used in central northern Italy, you didn't have much of a segmentation, right? The thing was somehow disordered. We have to talk about how the Romans came to that notion of tactics per se, as it was doctrinally intended, and that has been historically mistaken for kind of copy of an hoplitic array. It had actually nothing to do with that. As a matter of fact, it was an improvement of it, especially as the in-depth nature of the manipular legion really is. But even here, we shouldn't get fooled by you do that, you always win. Actually, the Romans didn't develop their manipular tactics to counter the Hellenic phalanx, because they fought mostly Italics and Celts in the process. So it's a wholly different story, and again, I have to make videos about that, because it's gotten wrong all the time. People need to think that there is some teleological reasons for which the Romans were passing to that formation, I don't know, to beat the Macedons, right? That's something that, you know, happened in the 2nd century BC. It has nothing to do with what was going on in Italy in the 4th, right? The important, though, is that heroic element that comes out and just pure and crude, without even material aid, is able to show off in front of the lines and coming back victorious, and everybody says, oh wow, this guy is the best, is evidently a part of that kind of frenetic Indo-European fury taming that divine transfiguration, and in fact the Imperium itself was entailed as such. So you can see, by comparing the Romans and the Italics, like kind of the gradation, especially during the 4th century, how that kind of happened, right? Passing from that to just a class of youths that fights in the front, but with a good social status, to eventually these guys are ineffective because they are ever lighter, and also society gets all with much poorer, lesser people, and you don't even raise them just because they are somebody else's children, like the sons of some great clansmen, but because they are now, you know, the Romans are enlisting all the Roman citizenry that is pretty large and didn't belong to the nobiliar clans. And that's the great actual reform that Rome carries out beautifully, and explains in part also the same manipular legion, that deepening on the formation as well, because before just the elite fought, in a sense, right? It was just these feudal landlords that controlled quarters in Rome and lands just outside, and then think about the Fabii that, you know, could fight again as Romans, but they fought essentially a private war and getting exterminated almost completely out there in the north, the frontier with, and so it's a completely different background that normally we don't take into account. The 4th century changes all in Rome, and the Italics are adapting too, because of course they have to face the Roman legion, and they have to unite, they have to increase that sense of hierarchy, cohesion, and in part changing their same warfare, of course. In these artistic representations, of course, we get what they thought. Then how they thought was probably already more advanced and actually similar, but not identical to the Roman one. Just they would come down, just not just guerrilla fighters, but also in open field, as we know they did. There were some pretty tough kind of comitatus warriors, like think about the Legio Linteata, this associations, of course, with the golden divine Uranian glory, etc. Especially the Samnites were pretty traditional in the view, aside from these other populations that were also Hellenically influenced, as we've seen. And that's where the Romano-Italic Confederacy mostly draws its military backbone from, right? These were the same men that eventually fought, I don't know, in the Pyrrhic Wars, in the Punic Wars, and were also brought overseas in Africa, in the Balkans, to victory. So just think about probably the redeeming function that this had in a military sense from such warlike peoples to be part of Rome, and deciding to remain part of under Rome or together with Rome or within Rome. And this is, as the aftermath of Cannae dramatically showed, Hannibal, which was frightening in perspective. And naturally, as we can see, for example, on a fragment from a painted tomb on the Esquiline Hill, the Roman infantry was already equipped in a different way from, say, the Paestan Lucanians or the Capuan Samnites, right? And of course, we know less about also the peoples in the interlands. This once again, also all the stuff I posted here is again mostly from a more Hellenic influenced background. As far as the Apenninic heart of the peninsula is concerned, we know a very few, right? But most of what we know is, of course, of a much greater military lifestyle. Thus, when we look comprehensively at this picture, we can't be somehow satisfied. The spear was the standard weapon of the Italic warrior in the 4th century. Most of these spears, unsurprisingly, like it was the norm of the time, were dual in purpose. They could be thrown as much as used as stopping spears, and obviously the largest, especially the largest headed ones, were mostly just spears and were not thrown. There was still, however, a wide range of typologies. The individual warrior would essentially decide which type to use and based on his skills of the type of combat he would have gotten in. And that reflects the gradual segmentation of also in the gradual differentiation of the same weapons that are evidently becoming part of an ever greater kind of combined armed tactical system, right? Because you wouldn't have to distinguish too much eventually what you can use in such, as we've seen, a wider typology, right? One thing is having a heavier weapon, a lighter weapon, then having other subtypes. It means that, again, warfare is getting more complex, for sure. There is also the differentiation horse, foot, right? But we see within the same that there were different functions, and this could vary also in the base of the peoples and the enemies they were fighting against, or where they were being shipped, as we will see, because actually a phenomenon that deserves much more credit is the Italic mercenarism in the Mediterranean. When we were making the video about the Ptolemaic army organization, we found an Italic in the Egyptian clerics, so that's actually fascinating. The typical Italic infantry warrior carried a heavier and a lighter spear, right? The richer ones probably had youthful attendants who carried a variety of spears, still in a heroic fashion. The normal tactic seems to have been, as long as you came in within effective range to throw these weapons against the enemy, and eventually closing in with a thrusting or dual purpose spear, right? Again, different types of of javelin consistency in this dual purpose suggests that there was an important dynamism that we can see eventually in the double type of pilum in the Roman army. And even in there we approximate, because actually the pila were often done in different ways, right? They weren't coming throughout all Roman history kind of in the same way. There are important variations and grades that reflect this, that however point at a specialization of these heavy javelins. As far as the charge, properly the attack was concerned, right? In the Roman sources we find, I think, just the battle of the Sabis River, the legionnaires throwing their pila because they were defending, right? But normally in all the other occasions you see the pilum thrown just before the charge, and again at this distance that was literally calibrated within a few seconds that the charge took place. And so the specific distance that entailed a lighter javelin and a heavier javelin for different ranges, which means that probably also these Italic infantries were getting collectively trained in an important way to maximize their missile employment. There was an important deal of regional variation. It seems that the Apulians were more javeliners than, say, the Lucanians. The reason, perhaps, again, being these open plains where also cavalry was more powerful, and so perhaps this subtracted resources from the infantry and or, also increased the possibility of carrying, for example, javelins on horseback, whereas Lucania is more mountainous, so you find heavier types of weapons because they were mostly more infantry based. However, we see that there's a blend. Just can't say that Lucania and the Samnium were the place where the heavy dual-purpose spear was favored, per se. The Samnites also being fundamentally good infantrymen, and better than the Lucanians, as a matter of fact, but for reasons of political cohesion, not because they were kept in a particularly different way. Always remember that the weapon just reflects the military purpose. Weapons do not make tactics. It's tactics that make weapons, right? There is also a double threat, but the technological impact is just minimal compared to the doctrinal one. And we're talking about, spears in the late Iron Age. So what kind of technological sophistication had to be there to make a difference? Even if it had existed, it's completely irrelevant. According to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, talking about Roman history, when Servius Tullius formed the Comitia Centuriata around the mid-6th century BC, according to the chronology, he required the 5th class of the poorest Roman citizens eligible for the military service to fight with the javelin, which is called in Hellenic saunion. We'll see it now in a while. So, of course, from a Greek perspective, there may have been a slight misunderstanding of what the term literally meant, right? Because according to Diodorus, the richer classes of the Servian army fought like hoplites, so with thrusting spears, and probably he's simplifying the thing from his background. Of course, we know, again, I already told you, we will not digress on the issue of the hoplitic tactics and whatever. Just know that in Italy, practically, hoplitic tactics was never used, right? And even if some elements may have been mutilated, it was mostly to fit a pre-existent military culture that was going another direction, as it's evident in the Roman case. And it's at best the equipment that is essentially adopted, and just for the elite that is more international. And again, what's the difference between actually an hoplitic armor and one of any other people at that point? It's just like asking whether for catching a mouse, a black or a white cat is better. That doesn't make any sense. However, we can spot during the 5th century a dynamic which is, to date probably at that point, in fact, that is the one we have illustrated of the ever greater specialization of javelins in Italic warfare. And not only, probably, that is to say, javelins were becoming ever heavier, and likely the reason is that, again, the armies were getting tougher and they needed heavier weapons to also throw in that kind of ever more specialized way compared to the random javelin you could have used from prehistory, to properly soften up the enemy ranks just before the charge, right? This explains a lot. And as a consequence, there was also a distinction with the lighter types of troops, and we see in Italy some people's properly training units that would have had to fight just as javelineers, and we've seen it even in technically the Libyan Legion in some way, even though, as we've seen, those were kind of heavier troops, as a matter of fact, but just starting to have a more skirmishing function. There is an interesting episode of 150 Messapians so from Apulia, who joined the Athenian expedition to Sicily in 413 BC. Right, a disaster, we all know that. But these Messapian mercenaries, interestingly enough, were all javelineers, right, as were the 300 infantry, whether citizens or mercenaries, that Metapontum in Lucania, according to Thucydides, had sent to the same expedition. So you can naturally, it's like in Greece, right? You can see that were mercenary hoplites as well as mercenary skirmishers. However, compared to the heavy phalanx, of course, it's obvious that these mercenaries going around were lighter troops in general. It's even the concept of turophoros becomes synonymous with, you know, not any type of ethnicity, but essentially a type of trooper per se, which fit probably most of also these Italic mercenaries. We have interesting evidence of the fact that the Samnites were likely the most skilled javeliners around. Again, heavy javeliners, not just skirmishers per se. So troops were famous because of the effectiveness of their javelin fire. The Greeks believed it so much that, albeit it has literally nothing to do with the etymology of the name, they called the Samnites Saunitai. So from the aforementioned word Saunian that also Diodorus Siculus used to describe the lesser class of the Servian legion back in the day. However, the Samnites were fine with that, because after all, what did they care whether the Greeks called them in a wrong way, and actually say pointing out their javelineers' expertise. There is an anecdote, in fact, based on coin evidence that dates to 325 BC, when a fractional coin from Tarentum, minted in silver, depicts a spear, right? A spearhead encircled by a laurel, red on the reverse, and on the obverse there is a female head, partially surrounded by the legend Sanitan, or Saunitan as a matter of fact, that is of the Samnites in the Doric dialect of Taras, and it's pretty, safe to assume that this spearhead indicated primarily the Samnitic specialization in the eyes of the Greeks, right? And probably matching what was the mostly supposed, in fact, derivation of the people's name, right? We don't have much of a detail from the coin about the javelin head. We can see that it's essentially a short but broad blade. It has a small shank, actually a rather wider version of the typical javelin that, as we've seen, was in use among the Italics. It's such a small coin, right? It weighs something between 60 to 75 centigrams, say coins art, especially for this fractional coin, is not particularly developed or even important or intelligible. It's just the thought that matters, let's say, and the fact that coin was celebrating the Samnitic mercenaries of the city, stressing the importance of their weapons, and of course for how important it was for the Samnites themselves. And as we have seen, the heavy javelin was pretty much there in Italy from her Celto-Italic background. The Gaisa, the Pila are essentially or whatever you want to call it, because it's practically the same, are the progenitors, actually, this Proto-Pilum, let's call it this way, of the heavy javelin used by the legionnaires and described by Polybius in the 2nd century BC, right? And speaking of Livy, but also of the Ineditum Vaticanum, even the same Diodorus Siculus that speaks essentially from a Romanized Hellenistic context. Of course, it was important to remember that the Pilum and the Scutum had been part of the Roman military history. That they were weapons essentially worth being proud of, right, in perspective. And that's when the Romans began also to ideologically develop the idea that they had somehow adopted these weapons from other peoples, because that's what the Ineditum Vaticanum says, that there is a huge problem here that we will discuss in another. It's actually a non-problem, right? But it's being created and should be debunked. Again, the fact that the Romans copied weapons from others. This is true, of course, if you look at Hellenistic torsion catapults, or if you look at specific types of weapons, from the falcatae to the Gallic arms and armor. But it's not a copy in as much it radically changed Roman warfare. Again, it's an armor, right? They weren't making radically different or qualitatively different weapons in the in late Iron Age Europe. It was just some designs were better, some techniques that were better, but we're talking about minimal differences, and that the Romans were definitely able to adopt and improve, and which they were proud of, because we know also from the history of technology that actually speaks of a level of development that is actually as far, if not actually already beyond, right? If you have the capacity of picking stuff from others and even implementing them in a functional way, you are more advanced in them. So this is not the point. But the Romans themselves began to, perhaps influenced by some sort of Hellenistic technologism, by saying that they had improved, having taken things that were not theirs, but they had made their own, thus surpassing even those who had created them. And lots of people today, as a consequence, as most actually anti-Roman prejudices exist today, actually speak out of Roman prejudices, which were not true, because again, those weapons belonged fundamentally to the entire Italian background. They weren't imports or something that they had to learn, that they just developed. They would develop as all weapons really do in a given context that no doubt was pretty open, right? Was pretty internal. In these tomes you can find, an Hellenic helmet with a Celtic armor, with an Italic sword. It's completely normal, and it's normal also in other countries. That's how apology works. But because exactly we are obsessed with the idea of this was scientifically, Italic or Celtic or whatever, and we don't even ask ourselves what these terms actually mean, which are just essentially wild approximations of something much more generic, in that we attribute values that we sclerotize, we hypothesize, we conceptualize from actually a military history that is in front of our eyes with striking evidence, and that tells us how, of course, Rome had evolved from a background, and that this background was also a great part of the same power that Rome had, in fact, employed to even expand her empire, because the Italic troops made up even a greater part of the Roman military than the same Roman citizens at a point. And eventually most of what we call the Romans, say at the time of Caesar or Augustus, are Italians broadly meant. even among Celts and, I don't know, Ligurians, Etruscans. Today we didn't talk about these specifically, but we will, surely. I think it's important to talk about these topics because, generally speaking, people don't care or they equivocate that. Everybody knows Imperial Rome, and there is a discrete attention towards the Roman military in the later phase for obvious reasons. But these genetic, seminal, ancestral moments are crucial because they show you really what happened behind the veil and what most people actually want to know, and they don't often get the opportunity to even approach dialectically in an adequate way, right? So I hope that this is going to be the first of a series that will periodically, in fact, augment in episodes about archaic, not just Roman, as you understand, but also Italic warfare. And I have also began to talk more about the Celts, so we already have a series about Hellenistic warfare, another about Hellenic warfare. We will have fun, hopefully, and that's what I surely do, because I love these topics. But for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.